All right, we've done our sowing, and now we're going to move on to the germination stage, which in essence is already started, but the germination is going to take place in trays that are stacked and covered. So let's take a look at what that looks like here. So, important thing to keep in mind is that crops will actually spend half of their life in the germination stage. And so this makes it quite important, as I just talked about, to make sure that everything is as optimum as can be during this part of the process. Now, ideally, germination takes place in an area separate from the growing area with its own climate control. Or if it is in the same growing area, you can change the climate a little bit. So the way we have it is everything takes place within the one greenhouse, but we have heaters below the germination area that keep it just a little bit warmer than the rest of the greenhouse. And we find that just gives us much better germination results, especially in the winter season. So really important there. Germination occurs in the dark with every crop. So there's no light needed, which means that gives you lots more options for where the germination could take place. It also means you're not using up lit space for germinating when that is obviously better used for growing crops that need the light at that stage. Now the trays are stacked during the germination process, and we'll take a look at some images here and talk about what that means and why we do it. This is one of the key components that give you really good quality microgreens and really good germination. So here's just a quick look at some stacked trays. This looks like a sunflower crop, and these are stacked in threes with a weight on top. Here's a pea crop up in the middle, and you can actually see down in the lower part there in the bottom we've got a crop of what looks like sunflower that are stacked but ready to be uncovered. And here's another look at some sunflower that are stacked and germinating and getting a little bit of growth there. So you can see it starting to emerge, and then as the process goes on, we see more and more the crop trying to emerge and essentially pushing the top tray up, and that gives you a good sense of when the germination process is done. So in these images, I'm showing you the germination that is separate from the production phase. Now, in some systems where you have limited space, you may want to combine the two. And what I mean by that is actually having them in the same space. So here is a home system where we've got the crop growing on top, which is here, and down below we've got the seeds, the crop germinating. And so this is what we do on a 2 harvest a week cycle within the same space, where is once the top crop gets harvested here, we're actually uncovering this crop into the light, and then it's going to be the next harvest, and then another crop will go under it in a cycle. So for example, if we uncover and harvest this top one on a Friday, this one gets light for Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, then gets harvested on Tuesday. It uncovers the next crop, which gets Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in the light and gets harvested on Friday. So it's a system that's a little staggered to have a little bit of a different growing cycle for each crop depending on the harvest day, but both crops seem to work out fairly well. So this is a really good system if you have very limited space, and this was actually a winter setup I did in my living room once where I didn't have separate space, and basically I was able to utilize this space to do both. And this was the original system I used when starting to grow commercially, and I do think it works fairly well. There are some challenges with it, but yeah, I think either system could work, and once again, it's just going to depend what's going to work best for you. So let's take a look at this and look at why we go through this process. So one of the things we're doing is we're actually mimicking a seed being covered with soil. Because we're not burying the seed, we're only putting it on top of the soil. We're kind of mimicking it by putting the next tray on top. So that's part of it. So the second thing we're doing is we're keeping light out of the process. And what this is doing is delaying photosynthesis. We want crops to photosynthesize at some point, but we don't want that to happen too early. And generally, as the plant develops chlorophyll, it does get more bitter and we want to make sure there's just enough light during the growth process to really turn it green and prepare it for harvest. We don't want an excess of light because that'll bring on more bitterness. By having the trays in stacks, what it's doing is trapping the moisture in the moisture within the soil and on the seeds, so you don't get any evaporation or anything. And this is really really going to make a big difference in germination. The other thing is we're pressing the seeds against the soil, and that's making sure we have really good contact between the seeds and the soil, because that's where water transfer is going to take place. As the seeds germinate and push the trays above them up, it's really going to strengthen the stems. And this holds true for whether you're using a large seeded crop or a small seeded crop. How long you cover them is just going to depend on that type of crop. The large seeded crops can be covered a little longer, whereas the small seeded crops, you often uncover them a little earlier, as they're a bit more delicate. And so they can push the trays up above them to a certain point, but then there's a real risk of everything shifting and the stems bending and not really recovering too well, which can make harvest a little more difficult. So the nice thing about having a large volume of soil is you don't get a lot of change in the soil temperature. You've got a good mass of soil there, so that keeps it very consistent. So you don't get fluctuations, which can be can really work against germination. And maybe first and foremost is that you're really optimizing your use of space. When we've got things out in the light and they're photosynthesizing, you need the space because you need every tray to be exposed to the light. But with this stage, you don't need the light. So the more you can keep things contained, the better you're going to make use of your space. Most people doing small scale production have space limitations, and so that's why we look at that. But all these other things make a difference as well, especially the weight and how it changes the growth habit. Now you might think, the way things are stacked in the images, you've got 3 trays and then a weight on top, and that concrete block is actually about 14 pounds. So you've got a stack of 3 trays and then 14 pounds on top, which almost all crops will have no trouble pushing up. So you might think, well, the top tray only has the 14 pounds on top, but the bottom tray has the 14 pounds plus 2 trays on top of it. And in short, you're not going to see a lot of germination difference between those. The bottom tray and then the middle tray, they might be a little shorter to start out with, but once they're placed into the light, I think that extra strength that the stems gain from the extra weight causes them to be able to grow quickly in the light stage and then recover. So you will see once you're ready to harvest that all your trays have very even growth. So yeah, the trays can take a lot of weight. A single block there is 14 pounds, and sunflower can easily do 2 blocks, and that really can actually improve germination quite a bit. So let's take a look at the stacking process. So generally we stack trays in 3s. I've done 4s and 5s, and basically just find 3 makes a good use of space. And if they're too tall and they start pushing the top tray off, they really can risk at toppling over. So stacks of 3s tend to be the optimum amount. I like to place the stacks really tightly to each other. This way there's no light getting in the sides. And we'll see in some images later that when stuff gets uncovered, it'll be yellow in the middle because there's been no photosynthesis, but green on the edges where the crop has been able to grow outwards and get some light. So once we've stacked our 3 trays that have been sowed, we then put an empty tray on top, and that's where the weight goes into. So basically you're putting another loaded tray on top. And so yeah, and that's your weight. So 3 trays that are germinating and then a weight on top. And there's many different ways to do that: bricks, cement blocks, anything like that. So just you can play with a few things. The concrete blocks work really well. The ones in the images are readily available from Home Depot, and they're the perfect size to fit in the trays. So in these images, even though we actually put a piece of coroplast on top and then the blocks, which helps evenly distribute the weight, the method we're using now is actually just the block right on each stack. I think in the beginning we were a little reluctant to put that much weight on, and now we've just realized that most of the crops can handle that weight no problem at all. There are thousands of seeds on each tray, so they're only each pushing up a little bit to lift that heavy weight. So here's that same image, and here is just the beginning of the germination stage, and the question I think that comes up the most is when do we uncover? And so you can see in these stages, and here's some P, like the trays are fairly even, and it's when we start seeing the trays shifting to the side and we see the stems coming up, like we saw in earlier images, that it's going to be time to uncover. So we'll take a look at that a little bit more. Few things to cover here in terms of the process. So once again, like that, getting really good germination in the beginning is really important for all microgreens. They don't recover well after a slow start. And because they're spending half of their life being covered up, you need to make sure that those are really good conditions. Keeping an even temperature is really important. So depending on your system, we're really mostly working on not letting things get too cool. Getting too warm can be an issue depending on the type of crops you're growing in your environment, and that's something you're going to have to figure out for each of your crops and for each system. In general, we find things being too cold is more of a problem than things being too warm. We need good airflow in the system because they're covered and there's not good airflow. The better airflow that's there, the less likely there are to be issues. And just keeping in mind, like, do not disturb the trays. People really like to think about uncovering them and watering them or inspecting them. And every time you do that, you're disturbing the roots, which in the early stages are quite vulnerable to damage. So our goal is to basically stack them, put the weight on, and just leave them until they're ready to be uncovered. Now, in the early days, you may want to take a look and uncover the stacks to get a better sense of what the rate of germination looks like. But over time, you should know just by looking at the edge of the trays how things are doing. Now, sometimes when I bring in new batches of seed, I will uncover them to make sure there's no fungus or anything settling in. That often happens when new batches of seed come in. But in general, your goal is to not disturb things at all. And as I mentioned, keep really good airflow. That's really going to be crucial for preventing disease. So the stacking and covering phase is really just a short little thing you do to get them germinating and getting ready for growth. But how you do that, again, is really important. So really close stacks with the weight on top in a specific area. And you're just going to leave them there. And within 2 to 5 days, depending on your crop, you'll be uncovering them and getting them out into the light so they can photosynthesize and ready themselves for harvest.